bombers or naval firepower. It was silence, the silence left behind when experienced pilots never returned. By 1944, the proud aerial elite who once dominated the Pacific were gone, replaced by teenagers with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. And as losses mounted, Japan's senior commanders were forced to confront an unthinkable truth. The skies they once ruled had become their empire's graveyard. This is what they said when the pilot ranks collapsed, and what it revealed about the war's final descent. They were never meant to be an expendable force. Long before the Pacific ignited in December 1941, Japan's aerial power rested on a small, fiercely trained elite. The Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had spent decades shaping an air doctrine built on exceptional skill, not overwhelming numbers. Their pilots were expected to be masters, men who could coax every ounce of performance from their aircraft, who understood aerial combat as an art form, and who viewed failure as dishonor. The foundation of this elite status came from Japan's punishing pre-war training pipeline. Naval aviator schools graduated fewer than 100 pilots per year. Candidates were subjected to relentless physical conditioning, complex navigation training, and survival exercises engineered to weed out all but the most capable. By contrast, the United States, even before transitioning fully to wartime production, was already preparing to graduate pilots in the thousands. Japan believed quality alone would compensate for a smaller force. The Pacific War would soon expose the limits of that belief. When war erupted, Japan's airmen were unmatched. Many were hardened veterans of China and Manchuria, having logged hundreds of combat hours before American pilots saw their first dogfight. During the opening months of 1942, this advantage showed. Over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean, Japanese aviators executed precise, deadly strikes that reflected years of discipline and experience. But superior skill could not shield them from the brutal mathematics of modern war. At the Coral Sea in May 1942, Japan lost seasoned carrier aircrews that could not be replaced. At Midway, a single catastrophic morning cost the Navy over 100 irreplaceable aviators, men who, by Japan's own estimates, would require nearly a decade to train to similar proficiency. And on Guadalcanal, the attrition became relentless. Every air raid, every escort mission, every night of fighting over Henderson Field carved deeper into the veteran corps. The United States, meanwhile, was opening new pilot schools every month. By mid-1943, the truth could no longer be ignored. Internal memos circulated quietly through the upper ranks of the naval air staff, reflecting a growing unease. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, senior commanders asked a forbidden question: what happens when the veterans are gone? By late 1942, the tone inside Japan's highest naval offices began to shift. What had once been confident wartime correspondents now carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Reports from the front, especially from the Solomon Islands, painted a picture that contradicted everything Tokyo presented to the public. In official broadcasts, Japan's aviators were still hailed as the heirs of Pearl Harbor, precise, fearless, unstoppable. But behind closed doors, the senior commanders who oversaw the air arm understood a far harsher truth. Internal assessments from the Naval General Staff warned that the losses sustained at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal were unsustainable. The surviving documents are blunt. Veteran aircrews were disappearing faster than the training pipeline could replace them, and the men stepping forward to fill their roles lacked the hardened experience that had defined Japan's pre-war elite. One analysis circulating in early 1943 stated simply that new aviators were inadequately trained for the pace and brutality of the Pacific Air War. The contrast was stark. While newspapers celebrated unbroken victories, the reality was that the average replacement pilot now arrived with fewer than 4 to 6 months of flight training. The United States, by comparison, was sending aviators into combat after 18 to 24 months of preparation. The gap widened with every passing week. American pilots climbed into cockpits with hundreds of flight hours. Many of Japan's young replacements had barely 50. Within the staff of Admiral Mainichi Koga, who succeeded Isoroku Yamamoto after his death in April 1943, the alarm became urgent. Koga's planners studied the attrition figures pouring in from Rabaul and Buin, where the air battles over the Solomons drained Japan's strength day after day. Their conclusion was stark. The Naval Air Service could not survive another year at the current rate of losses. Koga himself urged that, without a strategic shift, Japan's air arm would cease to function as an effective force. Morale reports were equally grim. Squadron leaders wrote of young aviators freezing in combat, overwhelmed by the speed and violence of engagements that veterans once maneuvered through with ease. They were boys sent into a furnace their training had not prepared them to endure. The warnings grew louder, but the warnings were no longer enough. What came next shocked even the officers who wrote them. By 1944, the crisis that Japanese commanders had feared was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. The elite air arm that had shocked the world in 1941 and dominated the skies through the early months of the war now existed mostly in memory. The Solomons campaign had drained the lifeblood of Japan's veteran aviators, but it was the summer of 1944 that delivered the final, irreversible blow. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, Japan committed what remained of its carrier air strength, over 400 aircraft, in a desperate attempt to halt the American advance toward the Marianas. The result was catastrophic. In what U.S. aviators would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. Most of the pilots lost had never faced a real air battle before. Many had fewer than 40 hours in frontline aircraft. Some had never executed a live combat dive or torpedo run until the moment they attempted their first and their last. Japanese commanders did not hide their despair. Surviving records speak with a tone of finality. One admiral described the losses as the mortal blow. Another called the day the death of naval aviation. Staff officers wrote, in stark terms, of the final evaporation of skill. These were not poetic flourishes. They were acknowledgments that Japan's air arm had ceased to exist as a trained fighting force. In frontline units, the consequences had already been visible for months. Squadron leaders reported rosters filled entirely with boys, pilots who stalled on takeoff, who misjudged carrier landings so badly they shattered landing gear, who struggled to maintain even basic formation coherence. Older mechanics, men who had served during the China War, spoke of the shame they felt watching replacement aviators climb into cockpits they were not prepared to command. The veterans who remained, a handful scattered across the fleet, understood exactly what they were seeing: the collapse of a tradition that had taken decades to build. Behind the scenes, the emotional toll was immense. Commanders blamed themselves, the high command, and the wartime culture that had refused to acknowledge weakness until it was too late. They knew the truth. Experience had become a memory, preserved only in the few men still alive to remember it. And with no experienced pilots left, Japan tried something desperate and irreversible. By 1944, Japan's aviation crisis had reached a point where even the most loyal commanders no longer pretended it could be reversed. The collapse of the veteran cadre, the destruction over the Solomons, and the disaster in the Philippine Sea forced the high command to confront an unbearable truth. The system that had once produced the finest naval aviators in the world was now incapable of producing pilots at all. The training program, once the pride of the Japanese Naval Air Service, unraveled with startling speed. Before the war, a carrier pilot received over 700 hours of flight instruction, often more. It was a grueling, years-long journey that transformed raw recruits into masters of navigation, formation flying, and combat discipline. But by late 1943, and especially by 1944, that system had been reduced to a shell of itself. The average trainee now graduated with barely 100 hours in the air, many with far less. Entire components of the curriculum were eliminated: night flying, advanced gunnery, dive bombing practice, and even basic carrier landing drills. Internal reports reflect the desperation with chilling clarity. One widely circulated statement declared, "We can no longer train pilots, we can only prepare them to die well." It was not resignation. It was an admission that the strategic situation no longer allowed for anything else. Fuel shortages crippled training flights. Engine wear went unrepaired. Instructors were ordered to graduate students regardless of performance because the front lines demanded bodies, not proficiency. In the halls of command, the psychological shift was unmistakable. Officers who once debated tactics and doctrine now spoke of survival, not victory. They understood that air superiority was lost, and that Japan's remaining air power would never again match the United States in numbers, quality, or experience. This shift laid the groundwork for new, extreme ideas, ideas born from the reality that untrained pilots could not survive traditional air combat. By mid-1944, early discussions appeared in staff briefings, proposals for one-way missions, operations that abandoned the expectation of return. These were not yet the organized special attack units that the world would come to know, but they marked the first formal acknowledgement that Japan's air war might be fought by pilots who were never intended to come home. Within letters, diaries, and hushed briefings, a quiet dread grew. Officers feared the decisions they were being pushed toward, but few dared to name that fear aloud. And then came the order that crossed the threshold, turning a pilot shortage into a national tragedy. By late 1944, Japan's Air Command stood at the edge of collapse. The losses in the Marianas, the destruction of carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea, and the grinding attrition over New Guinea and the Solomons had stripped the air arm of the veterans who once defined it. When the Allies launched their assault on the Philippines in October, the truth could no longer be hidden. Japan had aircraft, but almost no pilots capable of fighting in them. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly placed in command of the First Air Fleet, proposed an idea that broke with every tradition of aerial warfare: organized one-way attacks. These were not born from strategic innovation but from depletion. In internal discussions, Onishi acknowledged that Japan lacked the skilled aviators needed for conventional strikes. In a stark admission to fellow officers, he argued that the only remaining option was to use aircraft as guided weapons, piloted by men whose return was not expected. Behind the scenes, commanders wrote with a bleak honesty rarely reflected in wartime propaganda. One staff officer recorded that the youth of Japan must become our shields. Another called the proposal the last card. Others spoke even more plainly: "We have nothing left to send but their lives." These were not statements of confidence. They were confessions that the Japanese air arm had reached the end of its capabilities. The numbers told the same story. Between 1944 and 1945, Japan lost over 7,000 aircraft, many destroyed before they even reached combat. Experienced pilots were almost non-existent. Replacement flyers, often with only a handful of flight hours, were being ordered into missions that even seasoned aviators would have struggled to survive. Commanders saluted young men they knew would never return, hiding despair behind the rigid formality of military ritual. Onishi's special attack concept quickly expanded as the situation deteriorated. Units in the Philippines, then across the home islands, organized pilots for one-way missions against Allied naval forces. Each briefing room became a space where officers recited patriotic reasoning while internally acknowledging the truth. This was a measure born not of strength, but of utter exhaustion. The tragedy was complete. A nation that once trained aviators for years was now sending boys into the sky with the expectation of death. Yet even at the end, commanders realized something even darker about the skies they tried to control. By the final months of 1945, the once feared Japanese air arm had become a shadow of its former self. Across the home islands, airfields that once roared with the engines of elite Zero fighters and well-drilled bombing units now sat quiet, their runways cracked, their hangars burned, their aircraft scattered in pieces. Entire squadrons existed only on paper. Reserve pilots drilled in empty classrooms because there were no operational planes left to fly. In some units, commanders reported that their men had never even touched the controls of a frontline aircraft. The collapse was total, and it was human. Japan still could produce airframes makeshift, poorly equipped, often rushed into service. But what it could no longer produce were aviators capable of mastering them. The veterans who had formed the backbone of Japanese naval and army aviation were gone, their knowledge lost in the battles of 1942 through 1944. When the war ended, many surviving commanders admitted that defeat had not been sealed by American carriers, nor by the industrial might of radar networks and B-29s alone. It had been sealed years earlier, when the nation allowed its most skilled pilots to disappear faster than they could ever be replaced. Post-war interrogations made that reality unmistakable. Senior officers, freed from wartime propaganda, spoke for the first time with stark clarity. They described a system that bled out its experience, a force that entered the war with perhaps the finest naval aviators on Earth, and then spent them in battles where every loss carried a cost that no amount of patriotism or production could repay. They acknowledged that an air force is not merely a collection of machines. It is a repository of memory, judgment, and mentorship. When those qualities vanish, no number of aircraft, not even the most technologically advanced, can fill the void. The tragedy ran deeper than strategy. The loss of Japan's aviators meant the loss of a generation of teachers who might have rebuilt the service in peace. Men who could have passed on lessons in navigation, formation tactics, engine management, and survival, knowledge refined over decades, were gone forever. In their absence, Japan's war effort collapsed, and its post-war aviation future had to be constructed from the ruins of what had once been a proud and elite community. As the smoke of the war cleared, the skies over Japan fell silent. The aircraft were gone. The pilots were gone. And in the quiet, commanders were left with a realization more painful than defeat itself. The greatest loss was not territory or fleets, but the irreplaceable human experience that had once given their Air Force life.